From Focal Point Radio and Radio Fairfax in Fairfax, Virginia, this is the Mimi Geerges Show. Remember how in school we were taught that we had a government of, by, and for the people, and that we each had an equal say in our representative democracy? Well, that's the theory anyway. Actually, 3 out of 4 Americans believe that money buys results in Congress. Not so much in the sense of, here's an envelope stuffed with cash, now vote this way. That does happen, but not often. This is more of a scratch my back and I'll scratch yours situation. It's not illegal, but it's still corruption, and it still makes politicians focus on the money rather than what's best for the nation. Lawrence Lessig is a law professor at Harvard University. He says that this corruption is at the root of our country's problems and that it has to be fixed before we can address anything else. The book is called Republic Lost: How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Stop It. Lawrence Lessig joins me in the studio. Welcome.
Great to be here.
Have we lost our republic, or are you being alarmist?
No, I think in a very precise sense, we've lost our republic. Our framers gave us a republic. Conservatives like to remark that the word democracy doesn't appear in our Constitution. That's true. But what they meant by a republic was a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, they meant a branch of government that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. But our Congress has developed a different and conflicting dependency, a dependency upon funders. And
this is what you're calling dependence corruption.
That's right. It's a corruption of the intended dependence that our framers gave us. And that conflicting dependency means that the design, the republic design that we had, is no longer our design. And in that sense, certainly our republic has been lost.
You say that what we have is a gift economy. What does that mean?
It means that, as you described, I think, quite well in the introduction, it's not an economy where people are buying votes. Nobody is so crass. And they're very ethical about actually making sure that they're not engaging in behavior that could be translated into buying votes. But in a very elaborate dance that they develop by building very strong relationships with lobbyists at the center, people begin to make it possible for influence to be traded. And you do something nice here, I get you campaign contributions there. Those campaign contributions make it possible for you to run campaigns that, of course, attract others to make it possible for you to do me favors in another place. So in this way, it's almost the unintended consequence of getting rid of the old kind of corruption, right? We used to have just plain old bribery, and we've been pretty good at getting rid of that. But as you get rid of that kind of corruption, a new kind has to evolve, and this new kind is what I think of as this dependency corruption.
So how much, when you talk about campaign contributions, how much does it cost to get elected to Congress?
Well, the number is growing, of course. It's more than $1.5 million in a contested district on average to be able to be elected. And the challenge, though, is even if you're in a safe district, you not only have to worry about how much money you have to raise for yourself, you have to raise money now for your party. Your party taxes you to make sure that they have enough money to fight in the weaker districts or to try to regain control of Congress. So your burden is a burden constantly, regardless of how safe your own seat is, to raise the money that your party needs to get back into power.
Why is it costing so much, though, to run for Congress? Is it for all those TV ads that we don't want to watch anyway?
Yeah, largely. And it's a lot with the media consulting and polling. Of course, 40 years ago, people didn't do polls maybe more than once or twice in the course of a campaign. Now, increasingly, you're getting every week polls or overnight polls, depending on the nature of the campaign. And of course, consultants are finding ever more elaborate reasons to spend your money as a campaign. And as costs go up, the pressure on candidates to raise more money only grows.
It seems like such a waste of money, especially when you look at a presidential campaign. How much money goes into this?
It is in a certain sense, and that's because of the way we spend our money. So these candidates find that the very short, very negative ads turns out the most productive. So rather than spending all this money to help us actually understand the issues, we're spending the money to further polarize us, to keep us in our very small camp and opposing people in any other camp. But regardless of how we're spending the money, candidates are spending their time raising the money and becoming very sensitive to the sort of things they need to do to make sure that the money spigot continues to pour.
Lawrence Lessig is in the studio with me. He's an author and Harvard law professor. He's also the director of the Edmund Safra Foundation Center for Ethics at Harvard University. The book is called Republic Lost: How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Stop It. So what are the regulations we have in place now to combat corruption?
Well, the standard, most important regulation is a limit on the actual contributions you can make to a campaign. So you as a citizen can make a contribution up to $2,500 per cycle. And that is limited, as the Supreme Court said in Buckley v. Vallejo, so as not to give the appearance that bribery is going on. So they limited direct contributions. But the Supreme Court in that same case said you can't limit expenditures. So campaigns can spend as much as they want because there's no corruption reason for limiting expenditures. And most importantly, they said you can't limit independent expenditures, meaning money spent by a third party independently of the campaign promoting or opposing you as a candidate.
So that's where the big money comes in.
That's where the big money has come in. And the reasoning there was if it's independent, then nobody could think that there's any kind of quid pro quo involved. But again, that is an extremely narrow conception of how people actually engage in relationships of influence peddling, right? So, yeah, there's no bribery, there's no direct quid pro quo, but everybody now recognizes the way in which these independent expenditures are in some ways collaboration with the underlying campaign, and campaigns are very eager to inspire the right kind of independent expenditures and avoid the wrong kinds.
So I want to ask you something that I thought was very interesting, which was the debate between high fructose corn syrup and natural sugar, and how money in Congress affects that decision, really.
Yeah, so one of the striking things about the way in which our food is now made is that almost 40% of the products in your supermarket have high fructose corn syrup in them. And, in 1980, there wasn't a human being who had ever tasted this sweetener, but now it is a dominant form of sweetening. And one reason for this is that sugar is relatively expensive and corn is relatively cheap. And people who love the free market then say, well, that's what the market gives us, so we have to live with the consequences of the market. But of course, this is not an untainted market, right? So sugar is expensive in the United States because Congress imposes tariffs on foreign sugar manufacturers to protect the domestic sugar industry, giving them at least $1 billion in extra profit, but costing the economy at least $3 billion in inefficiency because sugar is 2 to 3 times the price in the United States that it is anywhere else in the world. And corn is cheap in the United States relative to sugar because corn is subsidized in the United States, something like $74 billion in the last 15 years, that produces, for some economists believe, a cost of producing corn that's actually negative. So as you lower the cost of corn and raise the cost of sugar, sweeteners shift towards the corn sweetener, which is high fructose corn syrup, and we see this increasingly spreading in all of our food products. But it also affects dramatically how we produce our food, including meat. So because corn is so cheap, it's profitable to feed cattle corn rather than having them graze on grass the way they were meant to. Well, you feed cattle corn and it turns out their digestive system doesn't process corn so well, so it kind of stews in there, and as it stews in there, bacteria grows, and as the bacteria grows, farmers have to feed them literally tons of antibiotics to fight the bacteria, but of course
But this is all crazy, Lawrence. Why would we do this to begin with? Why would there be a corn subsidy?
Well, this is the puzzle, and the puzzle, I think, gets a clue for an answer when you start looking at the enormous amount of money spent by companies or, investors in companies like ADM to push Congress to subsidize the production of corn, to subsidize the production of things like ethanol, which also depends upon corn, so that there's a wonderful market here for corn producers and for people who want to make corn derivatives, ethanol and high fructose corn syrup.
Can you point to any actual data that links campaign contributions to votes in Congress?
Yeah, so this is, it turns out, for political scientists, a very contested issue. And there's some very important studies that say we can't actually see the relationship. We see the money going in. We can't actually yet see the tight connection with roll call votes going out. Now, there's very important work that actually does claim to make the relationship. Clayton Peoples at the University of Nevada did the largest study of some 7,000 votes over 5 Congresses and found in, 6 Congresses, and found in 5 of those 6 houses a statistically significant connection between the contributions made and the actual results of legislation. But the more interesting work, I think, is done by people like, for example, Martin Gylens from Princeton. And what Gylens did was he looked at public opinion surveys that try to track what the attitudes of people were in different income groups. And then he asked, what did Congress actually do? Where did they go with those public policy surveys? And he looked in particular at 800 issues where the views of the very rich conflicted with the views of the middle class and the poor. And it turned out, when you looked at what Congress did in that case, Congress followed the views of the very rich, and there was practically no relation to the views of the middle class or the poor. Now, if you think about who funds elections, it is the very rich. The Occupy Wall Street people walk around with a 99% sign. They ought to have a 99.95% sign, because it's 99.95% of us who never max out to a political candidate. And it's, of course, those who max out that get the attention of the candidates. So 99.95% of us are invisible in this political system. 0.05% are visible. Those are the very rich, and those are the positions which the policymakers follow. So in this sense, I think it's pretty hard to believe that money is not driving or distorting policy, at least in this kind of case.
The book that we're discussing is called Republic Lost. We're discussing how money corrupts Congress. Lawrence Lessig is in the studio with me. He's a Harvard law professor. So you say in the book that money has caused Congress to be both distracted and distorted. First, let's talk about the distraction. What do you mean by that?
Well, because the congressmen and congresswomen spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money, they don't have time to do the sort of thing that we think they should be doing, or that certainly our framers thought they were doing. Look, the framers built a Congress, and they located it in one city because they expected they would get together and deliberate about important issues. They would sit in a room and listen to people argue about what they thought was right. And the first Congresses, in fact, that's what they did. They would show up at 10 o'clock in the morning. They would sit there for 6 hours. They would listen to the debates, and they would vote, and they would go home. It's a lot like what the British House of Commons looks like right now. I mean, still to this day, people sit in the British House of Commons. They listen to debates. They listen to question time. They deliberate in the way that a body is supposed to deliberate. Our Congress does not deliberate at all like this. They have all these committee meetings which they show up to, and many of them, they're members of these committees because it's a great way to raise money, because the people that they regulate are very keen to keep them on the right side. They have these ceremonial big service, events inside of the House, but their focus is constantly on this effort to raise money in a way that is radically different from even how it was 30 years ago. And the difference was produced by the reality that Congress was competitive between Democrats controlling it and Republicans, which drove both parties to ferociously seek to keep control, and therefore drove both parties to ferociously try to raise money.
So when they're spending this 30 to 70% of their time fundraising, what does that mean? How do they raise money? Do they just sit and call rich people and say, can you send me a check?
Well, it turns out, of course, there are very strict rules about how and where they can call. So they can't call from their office in Capitol Hill. So if you've been on Capitol Hill, it's kind of like elementary school, and you have these recess bells that ring every once in a while. And when the recess bell rings, that means there's a vote. And so the congressmen have to appear and race within the time window to do their vote. They show up, and it's a procedural vote. Their aide tells them how to vote. And then, for much of their day, they then leave Capitol Hill and they go to an office building very close to the Capitol. And in the office building, they put on a headset and they sit there with their finance director or their finance staffer, and they go through a list of people, cold calling people from all across the country, people they've never met. I've gotten these calls. I'm sure many of us have gotten these calls. And they say, "Hi, I'm Congressman X, and I need your help in this election." And that congressman doesn't know anything about who I am, but I'm just on a list. And that's what they do. They spend their time dialing for dollars. And then the bell rings, they get up, they race to Capitol Hill, they go through whatever procedural vote. You think about how we waste the effort and the attention and the time of these people around these two activities, and it's just crazy, but that becomes life for a congressman in this system.
So enter now the lobbyist, who would then save that congressman a lot of that time. Absolutely. And do the fundraising for him. How?
Yeah, so again, it's not crude, it's not illegal. So things are not connected. So I come into your office one day and I say to you, "We really need your help on this special spending bill to make sure that we get that bridge fixed in Pittsburgh." And then the next week I come in, maybe for a different client, but I come in and I say, oh, and by the way, we'd love to have a fundraiser for you to celebrate all your support for the builders out in Pittsburgh, right? And so, even a congressman can put one and one together and figure out what the connection is, and the staffers too. And sometimes the lines get so close that it's too difficult not to cross them. So I tell a story in the book about how a woman who was a very influential person from Hollywood was actually trying to get a meeting with a number of leaders in the House and the Senate about children's health issues and couldn't get any meetings. And finally called up the finance director and said, look, we need to get these meetings. And then all the doors opened up. And so she got all these meetings for all the people she was bringing through the Hill. And literally, as she was walking down the steps of Capitol Hill, she got a call from the finance director back saying, oh, I'm so glad things worked out. By the way, we'd really love to have a fundraiser out in L.A. Maybe you can hold this for us. It'd be really great to get some support for the senator. And,
people feel obligated then on both sides.
Of course they do. And that's the way we are as humans. We can't help but feel that obligation inside a system that is tied so directly to this influence.
So therefore, the people that have the money have the influence, and the rest of us have nothing.
Exactly right. They don't even get our voices heard because we don't have time to hear the voices of people who don't have lobbyists who can show up because we're spending all our time listening to the lobbyists.
And these, special interests that have lobbying firms and that they pay lobbyists a lot of money, all that money is really worth it. I mean, what was the numbers you had? $7 billion have been spent lobbying Congress during the first 2 years of the Obama administration, which is almost $1 billion more than the last 2 years of the Bush administration. I mean, that's phenomenal numbers right there. And what are they getting for all that money?
Yeah, so part of what they're getting is completely benign and good, right? I think even under the perfect system, we need lobbyists. We need lobbyists to be in there telling regulators how their regulations will affect the world. Regulators don't understand this, and it's good for lobbyists to be in there to do it. But as John Edwards used to say when we used to quote John Edwards, there's all the difference in the world between a lawyer making an argument to a jury and a lawyer handing out $100 bills to the jurors. And the problem with our lobbying system right now is there is no such distinction. The very same people who are making arguments to the congressman about what the congressman should do are the people who are also in the business of making sure the congressman has the money the congressman needs to run his campaign. So the congressman, unlike, for example, a Supreme Court justice, can't sit there and listen to the argument and say, yeah, I just don't buy it. I'm not going to go with you. The congressman is also thinking, geez, I can't get him upset because if I get him upset, he's not going to be so willing to help me in the next time we need a fundraiser. So the lobbyists serve two functions, one of them essential and one of them corrupting. And I think we need to find a way to eliminate the corrupting part and allow them to focus on the essential.
Well, there's also something interesting that you said was that another reason congressmen don't want to rein in the power of lobbyists is because they want to become a lobbyist after they leave office.
Yeah, this is one of the most terrifying things to recognize. And it was suggested to me by a very senior member of Congress, Jim Cooper from Tennessee, a Democrat, who's been in Congress for about as long as all but about 20 members of Congress. And he said, as he's watched Congress develop, Capitol Hill has become a kind of farm league for K Street, meaning people on Capitol Hill, and not just members, but staffers and bureaucrats, kind of have a life where they imagine, okay, I'll do my time inside government, and then I'll cash out by going and being a lobbyist. And I can make lots of money as a lobbyist because lobbying services are so valuable to the clients who pay for them because the lobbyists are providing these two functions, information and channeling of money. Well, if you change the system so that they're not in the business of channeling money, lobbyists are still an important business, but they're not as valuable as they are right now. And so the ability to cash out and become a rich lobbyist disappears.
When you say rich lobbyists, how much money does a lobbyist make?
Oh, they can make anywhere from $300,000 to more than $1 million. More than, the very senior lobbyists make many times.
Depending on how connected they are.
Exactly right. And what was very interesting, there was a study that was done by some economists who tried to track the billings that a lobbyist was able to make as a function of whether the guy or woman he used to work for was still in Congress. And what they found was when your mentor disappears, your ability to bill drops dramatically immediately after that person disappears, making clear that it is the connections inside of the system that makes you as the lobbyist so valuable. Well, if the value of lobbying services drops and I can't cash out and fund my kids' education by becoming a lobbyist, then I might have to either stay in Congress or get a real job, and that leads many people to worry that there's no way Congress would ever reform itself.
Lawrence Lessig is in the studio with me. He's an author and Harvard Law professor. He's also the director of the Edmund J. Safra Foundation Center for Ethics at Harvard University. The book is called Republic Lost: How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Stop It. Explain the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision of 2010 and what impact that's had.
So the issue in Citizens United was whether corporations had the same right that individuals have to spend an unlimited amount promoting or opposing a political candidate. And up to that point, the regulations had indicated they didn't have that right. And the issue in Citizens United was whether those regulations were constitutional. And my own view is that the particular corporation at issue there, it was a nonprofit corporation, should have been entitled to spend its corporate funds to promote its film about Hillary Clinton, criticism of Hillary Clinton. But the problem with the decision was that in the reasoning to get to that conclusion, the Supreme Court makes it sound like the only, quote, corruption that Congress is constitutionally allowed to address is the traditional quid pro quo, Rob Blagojevich, Randy Duke Cunningham type of corruption. And the kind of corruption that I'm talking about, this dependency corruption, is somehow invisible to Congress, and Congress is not allowed to address it. Now, that is the real danger, it seems to me, in the decision, because what we've seen since Citizens United is the explosion in independent expenditures by corporations, 300% at least over the last congressional election, and we'll see many times that when we get to the presidential election. And these independent expenditures are not, as the Supreme Court imagined, transparent. We don't even know in the presidential context where much of this money comes from because of loopholes that have been built into the law that allows effectively anonymous independent expenditures. So this huge amount of independent money that's out there will make it extremely hard for congressmen to remain, or presidents to remain, independent of those funders enough to be able to be free to lead, as Buddy Roemer puts it, free to lead because they're constantly afraid of how the money will be spent against them, and therefore will be dependent upon the money in these campaigns too.
So President Obama during his campaign had often said, the ways of Washington must change. Was he talking about the way money affects Congress?
Absolutely. He again and again.
But then nothing happened.
Yeah, this is the big disappointment, some might say, and I have said a betrayal. There was only one reason, I think, to support Barack Obama over Hillary Clinton. She had, by default, the nomination. Barack Obama took it from her. The reason to give it to him over Hillary Clinton was Barack Obama was promising this kind of change. And again, he indicated, we have to take up the fight to change the way Washington works. And, I supported him. He was a colleague of mine at Chicago. I knew him. He was a friend. But the thing that really excited me about it is I thought this finally, in the last 50 years, this was the only person who had united the nation enough on January 20th, 2009, to actually execute on this plan to attack the corruption that was the system and actually do something about it. And it's a great disappointment that once he got this place and had all of this political capital behind him, he frittered it away by playing a presidential game that's no different from the game that Hillary Clinton would have played. Now, had Hillary Clinton won and done everything that Barack Obama has done, I would have said, excellent, you did a wonderful job. You played the game you promised to play, and you played it probably as well as you could, given the way the Republicans were going to react. But Obama promised a different game, and he didn't execute on it. And it's so depressing to see that this opportunity for this fundamental change, which I think is essential, was lost.
So let's get to solutions, because I don't want to run out of time before we do that. You propose 4 strategies. The first is going the conventional route.
Yeah, through a statute. But I think for all the reasons we've been talking about, the likelihood of Congress passing this is almost zero. So if this sane strategy won't work, I suggest some insane strategies. And all the insane strategies are designed to find a way around the kind of hold that people inside the Beltway have over the public policy process. And the one that I think ultimately has the most opportunity to succeed is the out which the framers of our Constitution gave us when Congress itself was the problem. And so in our Constitution, there are 2 ways to amend the Constitution. One is that Congress proposes amendments. But if Congress is the problem, the second way is for the states to call on Congress to call for a convention. And the convention then gets to propose amendments. And those amendments, like Congress's amendments, are only valid if they've been ratified by 3/4 of the states. So 38 states have to pass any such
So we actually have to amend the Constitution to fix this?
Unfortunately, I think that we will have to amend the Constitution. And the amendment, I think, that would fix this has 3 parts. Number 1, public elections need to be publicly funded. Number 2, contributions to political candidates need to be limited, and I would say limited to $100. And number three, Congress has to have the power to limit, but not to ban, these independent expenditures. Because I think anybody should have the right to put their view out there and to say what they think about a candidate or a political issue. But Congress certainly should have the right to make sure that those independent expenditures don't dominate the system so much that candidates are just dancing in a way to get the right kind of independent expenditures. Now, the only way to get that amendment even considered by the states, I think, is through a convention. And the only way to get it to a convention is to build a coalition of lots of different people who see problems that they'd like to fix with the Constitution. So conservatives are out there right now pushing for a convention to limit the amount of the national debt. So I think that the convention is actually politically easier to imagine building the momentum we would need to get this kind of change on the table. And possibly, if we got close to getting a convention, Congress would try to get its house in order to avoid having a convention.
You dedicate the book to Arnold Hyatt. Who is he?
So Arnold Hyatt was the president of Stride Rite. Stride Rite makes Keds shoes. And he's an important figure to me because he shows a kind of courage that I think we all have to demonstrate. He was the second largest funder of Democratic candidates in 1996. And in 1997, President Bill Clinton invited him to a dinner at the Mayflower Hotel with 30 other large contributors. Each of them got to tell the president what to do, and Arnold was the last to speak. And Arnold stands up and he says something like, "Mr. President, I know you're an admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You need to put yourself in Roosevelt's shoes in 1940, when he realized he needed to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Because you too, Mr. President, have to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Not a war against fascists, but a war against us, fat cats. People who believe that merely because they're wealthy, they get to call the president and get public policy enacted. People who have convinced the American people that democracy doesn't work." Now, it took an enormous amount of courage to stand there among these friends of his, all of whom wealthy, and tell the president that he's got to cut off the power of these people and he's got to fundamentally change the way politics works. And as reported in a published account of the evening, Clinton was not receptive to the idea. He said it, quote, humiliated Hyatt in front of the group, cutting him to pieces. But I think that the thing we need to recognize is that Hyatt was in fact right. We need that movement to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. And we only save democracy when we make the funders the people, rather than having the funders be the 0.05% that now calls the shots in how Congress does its job.
Lawrence Lessig, he's an author and Harvard law professor. The book is Republic Lost: How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Stop It. It's published by 12 Books. Lawrence, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you.
Email me your comments or questions to feedback@mgshow.org and join us on Facebook and Twitter. You can support this program through a variety of ways. Just visit mgshow.org and click on the link that says Support.